Hello and welcome to the third episode of Samuel Varg interviews. This time I will talk to Candida Moss, who is a professor of the New Testament and early Christianity in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. Hello, Candida Moss. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
No problem, the honor is all mine. Before we start, could you just tell the listeners who you are and something short about this book that we're going to talk about that you have written?
Mm-hmm. Well, I am professor of New Testament and early Christianity at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. And my book, The Myth of Persecution, is about misconceptions that people, especially religious people, have about the history of early Christianity and about how Christians were supposed to have been continuously persecuted. And in my book, I argue that that was not the case, and that, in fact, Christians were only persecuted for a very brief periods of time in the early church.
Very interesting. All right, before we start the interview, 3 quick questions, and you will have 2 options. So the first question is, classical music or rock?
Rock.
Good to hear. Coffee or tea?
Oh, I don't drink either. I suppose it would be tea because I've never had coffee.
You have never had coffee?
I've never even had a sip of coffee. But given a choice, it would be Diet Coke.
Whew.
I know.
All right. And the last quick question: the city or the forest?
Well, it would depend on my mood, but probably the city. I'm sorry.
No, I'm a city person as well. Or, actually, I'm both. So, I really like the forest, but I live in the city, so I prefer it most of the year. But sometimes it's just nice to come out in the forest and relax. All right. This book, The Myth of Persecution, How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. I read it and I found it fascinating, a little bit provoking, and very educational. And I can imagine that many people are a little bit provoked by the title, and that they say, "Are you telling me that Christians are lying? How dare you?" What would you tell those Christians, or those people?
Well, the first thing I would say is the myth of persecution is what people think happened. The idea that Christians are always persecuted. And I should say some Christians were persecuted, and some Christians are persecuted today. So I'm not saying that persecution didn't happen, or that it doesn't happen, or that it doesn't matter. In terms of Christians are lying, well, yes, they are lying. Christians have lied in the past, and I think that it's important for Christians to face up to the reality of their traditions. Not all of our traditions are correct, and that's just a fact of history. So I'm sorry that that's troubling and upsetting, but I think that it's worth getting the facts right.
I totally agree, and I think that most people, even Christians, can face the fact that the church or Christian person have been lying, but I think that many are a little bit provoked by this thought that the earliest church sort of invented martyrs. That is a provoking thought for many, and from the beginning I was a little bit like, I wonder if this is sort of a conspiracy book or something like that, but when I started to look into it, it had some really good points, and I looked more into it, and I must say that you're probably right on many points.
Thank you very much. There were martyrs, there were some martyrs, but often those traditions are preserved for us in sort of medieval manuscripts. And, in that whole period, it was more important to convey a sort of entertaining message and to get your point across than it was to preserve the precise facts and details of historical events. So in terms of people lying, it wasn't a conspiracy sort of like you read in a Dan Brown novel. It wasn't like that. It was something that happened organically. And I don't think that Christians, when they sort of expanded traditions or invented stories or sort of exaggerated, I don't think they thought they were doing something wrong. I don't think they felt they were lying. They felt they were telling the truth. But they didn't have the same standards of history. And I think that they felt that in order to entertain and educate people, it was probably worth it.
Yes, I totally agree, and I think that is a very good point that you make here, and that is a very big misconception about history when people read the Bible and they say that, but it says so, for the creation myth or whatever. It says that the earth was created in 6 days, but they don't understand that the language for that time was a total different language. And when they are talking about sort of in different, like you said, in different terms about what is the truth.
That's right, and interestingly, the creation stories, in the ancient world, there were people who read the creation stories, like the Jewish philosopher Philo or the Christian commentator on the Bible, Origen, and they both read those stories and they said no one can possibly think the world was created in 7 days.
Yeah, and there are many theories what these 6 days actually represent or why the creation comes in that order and that sort of thing. And this is a little bit of sidetrack now, but one of the most interesting theories that I read is that they place the stars and the sun, the moon, and that kind of stuff in the middle of the creation to show that this is not the important thing of creation, because the Jews were living in Babylonia and these countries where they were worshipping the stars, more or less. And therefore they placed those in the middle and not in the beginning and not in the end to show those are secondary.
Right, that's an interesting theory, and I think that could be something to that.
Yeah, I think it has probably many layers. So, but yeah, we're sidetracking here now. We're going back to the actual interview on the subject. What I earlier have been taught among other people who, at least in some sense, grew up in the church or in a family that believes in God, I was taught that the apostles, except from John, was killed for their faith. And those are all horrific and fascinating stories. James was beheaded, or at least killed, with a sword according to the Acts. Peter was crucified upside down, and so on and so on. What would you give to these stories? Because the story of James is a little bit, I think it's the oldest.
Yeah. Well, the story of James is in Acts of the Apostles, so that was written fairly early. Yeah. So to the story of James, it's just a simple beheading. I don't have any problems with that. Mm-hmm. I would say for the other stories, so Peter being crucified upside down, for example, that story was written maybe 100 years after the events.
Yes.
And it was actually written by, we call them Gnostic Christians, so not Orthodox Christians at all. And the story I grew up with was that Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't think he was worthy of dying in the same way as Jesus.
Yes, that's exactly what I heard as well.
Right, and that's what you learn. And that idea comes from the 6th century. That comes from centuries later. What he actually says in the earliest version is that his death upside down is symbolic of how sin has turned the world on its head and how Jesus has now come to turn things the right way up. It's this long speech, and it's actually a little bit heretical. Huh. Which I find enormously ironic. But the whole story of Peter in the Acts of Peter is it's fanciful. You sort of have it's a battle between Peter and another magician, and they bring fish back to life, and they fly. It's sort of like Harry Potter. And the whole genre of that story is, scholars say that it's written in the style of ancient romance novels. So it's written to entertain, and I think it's difficult to take a story like that and say, this is what happened. It's written 100 years later. I don't know what happened to Peter. I think that he died. He probably died as a result of his evangelizing to people about Jesus. Mm-hmm. But whether the people who killed him for disturbing the peace or sounding like a revolutionary, or in some versions of the story for converting the concubines and wives of Roman officials to celibacy, or whether he was sort of the victim of persecution, we don't have any evidence of that. It seems like he was a troublemaker who sounded like a revolutionary. And the earliest stories make it sound like people had personal problems with Peter. They didn't have, an issue with, say, Christianity.
Uh-huh. I did not know about that magic battle. That was very fascinating. You must send me a link so I can put it up with this interview. That was great. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, I will. They are wonderful stories, but what's interesting is they weren't really written to be taken as sort of absolutely this is what happened. Mm-hmm. They are sort of playful, and people probably knew that at the time.
And that's what I find so fascinating about myths, because when we today talk about myths, we sort of think of something that is not true, that it is a lie or a made-up story or something. But when I hear myth, I more think of educational story. And that is more or less exactly what you are talking about here in this book, and I find that really fascinating.
Right, yeah, I'm definitely talking about that. I'm talking about these educational stories. I think the issue is, and I see that a lot in America where I teach, is when people take those myths and they come to the conclusion that this is historically true and has always been true and is true today, that Christians are persecuted in modern America today. That's when I think these well-intentioned stories about educating people suddenly become sort of destructive and I dare say even dangerous.
Yes, because what I find most fascinating in this book is the link that you make between ancient or even modern martyrdom and politics. And you have taken many examples of this when politicians use these kind of legacy of martyrdom to apply to themselves, that they are persecuted by Muslims or by the gays or liberals or whatever. And this is the most dangerous part, I think, of modern politics, when it is too sort of mixed with religion. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. I find this really troubling when you have a powerful group like modern American Christians, which are, they're divided up into different positions. But when you have a powerful group claiming that it is under attack, then it can legitimize any kinds of actions against others. And, we've seen that in the past when Christians have claimed that they were being persecuted by Muslims, and so they entered the Crusades, or they claimed that, they should go destroy pagan temples because then they could die as martyrs. So I worry about importing this idea into modern politics.
It's not that a big deal here in Sweden, but we always we are affected by what happens very much in the United States. But for a short story that when I recognized this, because I never really thought about that before I read this book, not that much at least. But for many years now here in Sweden it has been legal with same-sex marriages, and with our former Church of the State, nowadays the priests that are becoming ordained and so, they must apply to this. They must say that, yes, I think it's okay to marry same-sex couples. And that's quite a big step, because only 40 years ago here in Sweden it was considered that gay people were mentally ill. And I listened to this radio show just a couple of days ago, 1 week ago, something like that. And this woman called in, and she talked about that when you turn on your TV and read the newspaper, she said that everything you hear about is these disgusting gay people, and they are sort of taking over, and I feel that I, as a straight Christian woman, are being persecuted, and that I am unnatural. And I really thought that, this is actually exactly what Candida is talking about. When you sort of use this, I've always lived in a country where we have been persecuting gays, but now they are having the same rights as everybody else. And then you turn it around, so that you are the victim. Is that a big, something that's happening a lot in the States as well?
Yeah, it's happening an awful lot here. We're starting to see in America non-Christians or liberal Christians challenging the rights of traditional conservative Christians to sort of dictate how society should be run. So there's this issue with gay marriage, and there's also an issue with contraception and healthcare. And it's amazing how quickly, having dominated how society has been run for hundreds of years here in America, how the minute they lose their hold on that, Christians feel that they're under attack. They're being persecuted. I think psychologically it's because they look back to this sort of golden era when they called the shots, and they wish things were like that. But sort of the quick 180 from this is how society should be to you're persecuting us when you don't agree with us is remarkable. And coming from Europe, as I do, it's very striking to me. You know, England is not a very religious country, and to come here and to hear people talk about in politics and in the media, to talk about being persecuted when this is a free country and the laws are made, sort of basically by common assent. That's remarkable. And I think it's actually getting worse. People are becoming more hostile towards other groups, and that's problematic. There was just a study here in America that a very high percentage of Americans think that there will need to be an armed rebellion in the next 20 years.
Yeah, I heard that on the news. It's amazing, in a very frightening way.
And I think that if you want to try, even if you're not American, if you want to try and understand this, because everyone is sort of impacted by what America does, whether they want to be or not. If you want to try and understand this, you have to look at their language and at the specific forms of Christianity that we see here.
Because I've always, here in Sweden at least, or in big parts of Europe, we have this very monotone picture of the States, that it's just in one way. But the last few years I've really looked into the country and understood that it is very complex, with many forces sort of pulling from different sides. You have a big liberal group that are sort of emerging for the first time, as far as I understood. And you have this very strong Christian right wing with a lot of money and a lot of power that are still struggling to sort of keep this hold over the society. And that is a little bit frightening to see.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not, because America is so powerful, and it's such a big country, and you can go to parts of America and you'll see a real shift in cultural values. So if you're in the Northeast, people are more liberal. They generally think that there should be healthcare and food and shelter and education for everyone. But if you go to the deep South, you may find that people no longer even really think that education should be a part of the state. And so there are really different Americas. And some of these people have a lot of money behind them. Yeah.
And that is so far off from at least the Swedish reality, where we have free healthcare, free education, and more or less everything. Where many, I would say that we are those people that are persecuting them because of their faith, because we come with this socialist devilish power or whatever, and that is so alien for me.
Yeah, it is. When I first came here to America, I used to think that Sweden was sort of the most advanced country in the world, because you have this very well operating state that provides for everyone. And I came here to America and people told me that they were socialists in Sweden. And it took me a while to figure out that the word socialist was extremely bad in America.
It's more or less a swear word.
Yeah, and it's remarkable to see Christianity being blended with capitalism so explicitly. You would think that Christians would be especially concerned to provide healthcare and education and food, but that is not the case.
Very interesting. What do you think makes so many religious people feel threatened by the change of society, and why do they sort of summon this role of persecution and martyrdom?
Well, I think there are a couple of impulses. One is this was hardwired into Christianity from the beginning. With the death of Jesus on the cross, suffering now became a good thing. If you suffer like Christ, that's to your credit. And the idea that, we should suffer, we should expect to be persecuted, that's in the New Testament. What's interesting is that Jesus' predictions of suffering don't quite bear out. So he predicts, for example, that John, the son of Zebedee, would die as a martyr. At least that's what pretty much everyone thinks his prophecy is about. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't die as a martyr. And he makes other predictions that don't come true. So I think one reason is that there's this idea that Jesus predicted that they would suffer and be persecuted. And so it's easy for Christians to go to those texts. And the other is just base sort of psychology. Christianity has really been the dominant cultural force in Western Europe and North America now for hundreds of years. And people haven't questioned the rights of sort of Christianity to sort of draw up social values and rules. It's really very recently that people have been willing to talk about, gay marriage or in anywhere really. It's just the last 50 years, and I think that here in America, Christians are only just experiencing that, and this is a very religious country, and I think the feeling is that things were so much better before. And they compared the experience before to the experience now. They feel that it's so much worse, and they feel that they're under attack. They have this comparatively liberal president now. So I think those are the forces that are kind of feeding into this idea. They had the raw material in the Bible and in the history of the early church. And it was really that period that solidified the idea that Christians are always persecuted. And then once you have that idea, then you can take the experience of Americans today and very easily slot it into this model where Christians are under attack by demonic forces.
And those demonic forces are like social changes, Islam, and that kind of...
That's right. And in that worldview where it's good versus evil, God versus Satan, there is really no contest that's too small. So, the inability to say prayer in public schools somehow becomes the work of the devil. So it's very easy to interpret even small, sort of very neutral social changes as persecution.
Fascinating. Candida Moss, the author of The Myth of Persecution, How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. Thank you so much for doing this interview. And is there any last few words that you want to tell the Swedish audience?
I would say thank you so much for listening and for having me on your show. And you can follow me on Twitter or join my Facebook group and email me. So
I will link to your Twitter and your Facebook page, and I highly recommend to all the listeners of this book. It's very fascinating, and it's, as I said, provoking and a very good read. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this time. If you liked it, please subscribe to my channel, like and share, and please don't forget to comment. I will be back in 2 weeks with a fascinating interview with a magician called Richard Turner, and he's one of the best card manipulators in the whole world. But there is a small twist to that story. He's blind. Well, that's it. Candida Moss, give her a hand. Well, maybe not where you're sitting, but people will think you're strange. But if you like that, please do. Okay, see you in 2 weeks. And don't forget, subscribe, like, and share. Bye-bye.